Yes, welcome to the September seminar for Ujjayi Archaeology Institute. So we've invited Mari McLean today, and Mari is a PhD candidate with the University of Glasgow, and a Hebridean, if I've understood it right. Yeah. So um, today's seminar, I think, is very close to your heart. It's about how human and animal populations were distributed across the Western Isles in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, and questioning this reputation that the Western Isles now have for being remote and isolated. So we're all very much looking forward to hearing about your research, Mari. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will just try and share my screen. I'm not used to using WebEx, everyone, so please bear with me if I make any mistakes. Okay, so yes, as you've all just been told, my name is Mari McLean. I'm working on my PhD in the Glasgow University and through CERC. I'm also working part-time for UHI Outer Hebrides on their Surfer project with Dr. Rebecca Rennell and Dr. Emily Gall. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you today about Neolithic and Bronze Age population movements in the Hebrides. So first off, I'm going to talk you through the social context behind my project. And then I'm going to follow that up with a bit about how this impacts the literature and things. Then I'm going to talk about my project specifically, discuss the science behind it, go over my own results, and then some closing remarks, some conclusions. So to start with, I just want to give some context to the title itself, In the Heart of Beyond. You might be wondering where it comes from. So it comes from a specific book called The Stornoway Way, which is by Kevin McNeill. Kevin McNeill is an author from the Isle of Lewis. And the quote itself says, "They don't know the likes of us exist, and they never did. We are who we are because we grew up the Stornoway Way. We do not live in the back of beyond, we live in the very heart of beyond." So this quote in particular really spoke to me, and I feel it really captures that feeling of being from the islands and the way that they're portrayed in popular literature, and just the public sphere of the UK. So I assume most people here are aware of where the Hebrides are, but just to be sure, here's a map of Scotland with Shetland and Orkney up in the north, and then the Hebrides are those islands out to the west. So they're actually split into two archipelagos. There's the Outer Hebrides and the Inner Hebrides, and they're separated by a stretch of water called the Minch. So the Inner Hebrides are actually kind of difficult to really see the full extent of because they're so close to the mainland of Scotland, and there's a lot of small islands. So here is a map without the mainland, just to kind of give you a bit better idea of the full extent of the Inner and Outer Hebrides. I hope this also gives you a better idea for the location of some of these islands in relation to each other, to give you an idea of like the lay of the land, so to speak. So Lewis, Skye, St Kilda, the most famous island of all. Like Raggy said earlier, I have a personal interest in this. I'm very invested in Hebridean archaeology and in this project in particular because I'm from the Isle of Barra. I'm from right here. My father's family are all from Barra and the Bishop Isles, which are all the islands to the south of Barra. So I have a very personal connection. And I can therefore talk from experience when I say that growing up as a Hebridean, it's very difficult to ignore the overwhelming messages from the general public as to how the mainland of the UK sees the Hebrides and how they see us as very remote, very isolated, difficult to reach. So there's countless books and documentaries that are titled after this idea that we're living on the edge, whether that's the edge of Europe, the edge of the world, the edge of the Atlantic, the edge of civilization. And also after this idea that you have to go on a very large, long, epic journey to get to these islands. So a particularly famous example of that is Samuel Johnson and James Boswell's works, Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland and the Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides. So the part of what makes these writings interesting is that Samuel Johnson named his work A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. So today, the name Western Isles specifically refers to the Outer Hebrides. Johnson and Boswell didn't make it that far. They only made it to the Inner Hebrides, and they only went to about 3 or 4 islands at most. Their grand tour was actually mostly of mainland Scotland. They went all the way around the east coast, cut across the Highlands, and then went off to Raasay and Skye and a couple of other Inner Hebridean islands. So already you're probably getting an idea of just like the idea that people feel like they have to go on an epic journey and take a very long time to get to these islands. Some of these books treat the Hebrides and talk about them in a similar manner to how colonists maybe referred to the New World when they were first arriving. The discovery of the Hebrides is a particularly good example. Clearly, the Hebrides were only discovered in 1745, not earlier than that. And this ties into a broader tendency to treat Gaels and Gaelic speakers from the Hebrides and across the Highlands as well, to be honest, in a manner reminiscent of the noble savage archetype. So for anyone who isn't familiar with the idea of the noble savage, this is the idea that primitive peoples who are not so technologically advanced as most European nations, they're much more noble, they're much more in touch with the landscape, and they're more in tune with what's going on in nature. They understand nature much more inherently, and it's usually associated with First Nation peoples, Indigenous peoples of countries that underwent colonization very heavily. That idea in itself is much too big of a topic to discuss in this talk. It could be a lecture all on its own. But it is something that is, I feel, very important to keep in mind when you're consuming any media or reading any books that are related to the Hebrides. And it's also interesting to see the parallels between how people talk about places like the Great American Wilderness and how the Hebrides are described. So Elizabeth Bray, the author of The Discovery of the Hebrides, she said, "The Hebrides, remote and beautiful, the isles, according to the ancients, on the edge of the world." Who the ancients are, she actually never clarifies. We don't know who they are. They're just an amorphous group of people. Meanwhile, Baxter and Crumley, a few years later, described St. Kilda as God has wreathed his hoard in mists to intrigue the corrupted world, then set the lure of inaccessibility to snare its curiosity. The encompassing seas are both defender and in their own good time exquisite destroyer of St. Kilda. So here we see this idea that these islands, and in particular St. Kilda, are uncorrupted and unpolluted by the modern world and by modern trappings. So this bleeds over into modern tourism, and you can see it in a lot of adverts, like this. So this is a tour that's run by a Scottish company. I think they're based on the Scottish mainland. I did try to find out where they're based, but unfortunately, there was no information about their headquarters. They have multiple tours across the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, but this one in particular is the only one that describes the area being toured in these terms. The mythical Western Isles then describes them as a true wilderness, Scotland's most remote Western Islands. So with respect to the idea that it's a true wilderness, this is very flawed. The islands have been occupied for upwards of 6,000 years, and they're only a small landmass on each island. So you can imagine that humans have used almost every single inch of these lands in some capacity. They are not a natural landscape. It goes on to describe them in a bit more detail So this long string of islands flung into the Atlantic Ocean on the edge of Europe conjures up remote mystery and true wilderness, a place to be embraced and no moment of its spectacles missed. And then further down, it says, there are small but vibrant communities which form the last bastion of truly Gaelic culture. Here, life happens at a refreshingly gentle pace, with people eking a modest living from croft farming, fishing, and the weaving of their famous cloth, Harris tweed. So hopefully you're maybe starting to pick up a bit more on that romanticized language. This does not jive with anything that I have really experienced. Yes, people do make tweed. Yes, people do live, doing crafting and fishing, but it's not experienced in these terms, shall I say. So this all culminates in some very interesting magazine and newspaper articles. This is a particularly good example from that bastion of journalism, The Sun. So this is about a particular house on the north end of Barra called Suichen, and it went up for sale a few years ago. So it describes this house as a remote coastal cottage surrounded by a secluded white sand beach 5 hours away from the mainland. So the house is actually that building that you can see in the foreground of the photo. And it has about 5 bedrooms in it. So I think we're kind of pushing the bounds of what's considered a cottage already. And technically, yes, this is 5 hours from the mainland if you take a ferry, but this is less than a minute from the airport, the local airport, and it only takes an hour to get to Glasgow from, by plane. And the airport is actually in the background of the photograph. It's right there. This is the only airport in the world that has scheduled flights landing on a beach. So even that beach there is not the quiet, idyllic landscape you may think. That is the runway for our planes. So this is maybe a really good example of how ideas of remoteness, seclusion, isolation, they're very dependent on your own experiences, your own biases, and your own perspectives. Compared to somewhere like Heathrow, yes, this is very isolated. This is very quiet, very peaceful, very secluded. But from a Barra perspective, this is actually one of the busiest places on the island, particularly in summertime. So in summer, we now have 3 flights a day because of its reputation as the only place in the world where we have scheduled flights landing on a beach. We get a lot of tourists who specifically want to see the plane landing on the beach. We have people also coming in for day trips, coming in on the first flight of the day and leaving on the last flight. There's also a cafe in that airport, so a lot of locals and tourists will turn up to have their coffee and to have lunch. And we get a lot of bus tours coming through here, specifically to see that plane land. There is another beach out of frame that's on the other side of the dunes, and maybe giving them the benefit of the doubt, maybe that's what the reporter was referring to, but even that beach, it's actually very popular with locals for surfing, for going for runs, walking the dog, all of these kinds of things. So in reality, this is actually quite a busy place as far as islands are concerned. So this background climate of perceiving and portraying the Hebrides in this way has a very real knock-on effect. Our cultural bias is obviously to see these islands as remote, as peripheral, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that they are backwards, very socially backwards and undeveloped. This has a real impact on how we as researchers view and understand them, and I have no doubt that it actually impacts Hebrideans as well in how they see themselves and their landscape. So this is a very blatant example. This is a paper titled The Hebrides, A Cultural Backwater, written by Kirwan in 1938. He started off strong with the title and he continued that way. He actually states that the Isle of Lewis didn't leave the Iron Age until the 1880s. That's clearly not true. They left the Iron Age around the same time as most of Scotland. So these ideas also carry over into other assumptions, particularly in relation to the more taboo behaviours like inbreeding. We've all heard the stereotype that islands are hotbeds of inbreeding and all islanders are inbred in some capacity. And this is actually this has been the subject of research. So this is a paper from 1944, contribution to the anthropology of the Outer Hebrides, where they refer to the islands as being inbred in such a manner that clearly it's an inherent understanding. It's not a questionable thing. It's a fact that is just the baseline assumption. There are other papers later on. So this is from 1976, Population Structure of Barra, and 1983, Inbreeding as Measured by Dispensations and Isonomy on a Small Hebridean Island, Eriskay. So each of these is on a different island, but they're all in the Hebrides, and they're all related to inbreeding in some capacity. The last two in particular, they make use of isonomy. And if you, like me, are not familiar with this term, I only learned about this the other day. Isonomy is essentially the use of last names to trace relationships with people. So these papers were using the idea that they could trace families, seeing if people who have the same last name then got married and then procreated. That idea is fairly flawed. So it shows a lack of cultural and historical understanding of the islands, and to be honest, probably the Highlands in general. Last names in the islands are not an indication by any means of relationship or kinship in terms of genetics. It's usually just a sign of which clan was in control, which clan was most powerful. On the Isle of Barra, for instance, we have a huge number of people called MacNeil for their last name. Majority are not related to one another. So you may be wondering, why am I raising all of these points? So the reason that I'm bringing all this up is to highlight the fact that if researchers and writers don't necessarily understand modern Hebridean populations and the way that they see themselves, the way they move through the landscape and see their own landscape, it does raise the question of how well they are able to understand historic and prehistoric island populations. Of course, I'm biased. I am an islander. I grew up with cars, I grew up with ferries and planes. This is no doubt impacting the way that I see this landscape. I no doubt see this as a much more interconnected landscape than many people do, potentially from previous populations or previous generations, sorry. However, I would like to highlight this phrase that really jump out at me from the literature, the idea of a sea of islands. And it comes from the anthropologist, a Tongan and Fijian anthropologist called Epeli Hauofa. I'm really sorry, I managed to slaughter that name every single time. But he made the point that there's a big difference between islands in a far sea and a sea of islands. The difference in emphasis is crucial. In one, you're emphasizing the dry surfaces in this big ocean, and in the other, you're looking more at the way that these places are holistically connected, which I feel is a very key shift in perspective. And I think it's very important in relation to trying to understand and study island populations, no matter what period in history, whether it's modern or prehistoric. So my project. The main question that I wanted to sort of try and tackle then, with all of this context in mind, was, is there any evidence of continuous or localized inter-island movement in Hebridean prehistory? So I want to differentiate between the large-scale movements that we know happened, like the arrival of the Beaker culture, and I was more interested in this idea of if there's continuous movements between the islands throughout all of this time, and if it was traceable in the archaeology. I'm also interested in how extensive it is and what this can tell us about the people at the time, the cultures at the time, and the populations. So the question then is, how do we understand mobility, social connections, and that amongst a sea of islands during prehistory? So one of the more common methods of doing this is through looking at material culture. So for anyone not familiar, material culture is essentially everything that we use in daily life. Usually it takes the form of pottery in archaeology. So whether we see similar patterns, similar shapes of pottery across various areas, it can refer to the architecture of various buildings, that sort of thing. I decided to opt for a laboratory-based approach using stable isotope analysis or radiocarbon dating and Bayesian analysis. And I hoped that this would allow me to build up a picture both across the geography and through time of any potential movements that were taking place. So I'm now going to go a bit more into the science behind this project. Please bear with me. I find it very interesting and I hope that you will too. And I'm going to start off with stable isotopes. So typically stable isotopes are used to understand diet. In more recent years, it's becoming more common to look at residency and population movements with isotopes though. Carbon and nitrogen are already routinely looked at when we're carrying out radiocarbon dating, specifically to try and look for marine diets. Marine diets can really screw with your radiocarbon dates. They make everyone look a lot older than they actually are. So it's important to be aware of if there's a marine diet going on in your sample base. So carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, I've grouped them together because you tend to find them in the collagen, the bone collagen, and then strontium and oxygen you'll find in the enamel, the tooth enamel. So sulfur and strontium are the ones that most frequently get used in relation to mobility and residency. And the essential idea behind that is that you can measure the sulfur or the strontium levels in an individual and compare that against the surrounding geology. The surrounding geology is what impacts our sulfur levels, so it's highly important. And if we see a drastic difference between our sample and the local area, that is maybe an indication that that individual is not from that area of geology. So this could theoretically give us an idea who was a long-term resident and who very recently arrived in the area. This project uses carbon-13, nitrogen-15 and sulfur-34. So carbon and nitrogen to look at diets and sulfur to look at residency and mobility. Because I'm using sulfur, I have to acknowledge the effect, the sea spray effect. I won't go into too much detail about it, but it is essentially the impact that proximity to the sea has on your sulfur levels. You tend to see a raised sulfur level from somebody who is from close to the sea, and it can impact up to 2 or 3 miles inland. Very early on in this project, we decided that because we're talking about islands that are relatively small, the sea spray effect would probably affect the entire island. So we wouldn't necessarily see a drastic difference between somebody from the coast of the island and somebody from the center of the island. So the sea spray effect is effectively rendered null and void. We just need to be aware that this is something that happens. So moving on to radiocarbon dating, everybody is very well aware of radiocarbon dating and what it does. So I'm not going to spend too long talking about this, but just to give a very quick rundown of the science behind it, we measure the radioactive isotope carbon-14, which means that it decays at a known rate. And by measuring the quantity of carbon-14 in a given sample, we can then calculate its radiocarbon age and then calibrate it to give us a calendrical age range. So on the right, that's an example of a calibration curve. These are the kinds of graphs that we use to try and calibrate our dates, or radiocarbon ages even. And on the y-axis, you can see there's C14 BP, so that's the radiocarbon age before present, where present is 1950. So if we were to get a radiocarbon age of 9,000, we'd go up the y-axis to 9,000 and project across until we meet that red line, which is the calibration curve. And then we'd project downwards to the x-axis where we would get a calibrated age before present. And we can then work out the calendrical date. So why am I using radiocarbon dating in this? So there's two main reasons for this. The main one is to make sure that I'm actually getting samples from the right period. We need to constantly be sure that we are using samples from periods that we're wanting to study. If we were to take a sample from much later on, it could have a massive impact on the way our data comes through. And actually, one of my samples from Alisdale on Barra did return a much later date than expected. It wasn't prehistoric. So it just goes to show that it's really important to do these checks and balances. And the second reason for it was to be able to create Bayesian models, which would hopefully allow me to see if there was any patterns or differences through time in terms of mobility. What's a Bayesian model? I'm really glad you asked. So this relies on Bayesian analysis. Bayesian analysis is essentially a statistical method of analysis, and it uses spatial information and stratigraphy to produce statistically more precise chronologies using the equation that you can see on your screens right now. Posterior beliefs equals standardized likelihood times prior beliefs. In English, that basically means it's a method of calibration and modeling, and it helps us to find more precise radiocarbon date ranges. An example of a Bayesian model is there on the right. That's one of mine using my own dates. And you can see that there's maybe some outlines, some black outlines, and then some filled in darker black areas. The filled in dark areas are actually the calibrated and more precise radiocarbon date ranges. So it can give us a much tighter chronology for any given site that we're looking at. So with respect to the actual sampling itself, I wanted to sample human and animal remains. So the idea was that I could take human remains for any given number of islands, and on those same islands, I could create a baseline of sulfur data to compare against using animal remains. So for the human remains, I was only looking for Neolithic and Bronze Age, absolutely no other period. And where possible, for every individual, I took 3 samples, one of the second molar, the femur, and one of the rib. The reason for this was to target the 3 different rates of bone turnover that you get with enamel, cortical bone, and trabecular bone. So one would give us an idea of early life, so around child age, being an infant, one a few years before death, and then one up to a couple of months before death. So you'd almost get like a snapshot across an individual's lifetime rather than only one singular point in their life. With respect to the animal remains, I initially was only looking for a Neolithic and Bronze Age. However, there just wasn't the quantity of material available. I, in fact, actually managed to get no Neolithic animal bones to sample. I was only sampling herbivorous animals because diet is very important when you're looking at isotopes, as I've mentioned already. And the elements that I used was very dependent on the minimum number of individuals that were in each context and each site. So some sites I had a lot of deer mandibles, and others I had lots of sheep phalanxes. It varied quite largely. So I ended up with samples taken from sites from the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. I've just realized I made a mistake because I didn't get any samples from the Neolithic. Please excuse me on that. But yeah, the quantity and the quality of the surviving bone had a very big impact on my sampling strategy. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that just now. So we're first going to talk about the external biases. So these are the things that I could not change even if I wanted to. These were just things that had an impact on my data collection. So when I first started off this project, I thought it was going to be very, very easy to find Neolithic remains because there's Neolithic chambered cairns all across the west coast of Scotland. They're absolutely everywhere. If you ever visit North Uist, there's one on just about every single hill. And with West Coast Neolithic chambered cairns as well, you do tend to find that there's a reuse of them in the Bronze Age. So a lot of them will have a Bronze Age burial inserted into the top or into the side. So it's almost like a 2-for-1 in terms of trying to get data and material. However, as I was very soon to discover, a lot of them were excavated, quote unquote excavated, in the early 20th century by antiquarians So a huge amount of what might have actually survived up until that point is now gone. We don't have it. We don't know where it is. I have no doubt that there's a lot of these bones and human remains scattered across the UK, but wherever they're being held, people don't necessarily know what they are, where they're from, who put them there. Additionally, the Neolithic and the Bronze Age doesn't have great preservation levels. And further, there is actually very uneven archaeological investigation and research across the Hebrides, by which I mean there is considerably more research that's being carried out in the Outer Hebrides versus the Inner Hebrides. So in terms of internal biases, these are the things that are very much to do with my data and my material. So across Scotland, there is actually a lack of sulfur data available in the literature. This is because sulfur has only in recent years started to become more frequently used. Up until relatively recently, you needed quite a substantial amount of bone to be able to get accurate sulfur readings. Of course, people were not wanting to sacrifice that quantity of bone. However, in recent years, we've had a shift in technology, which means that we can take about the same amount for a sulfur sample as for radiocarbon dating and for carbon and nitrogen. That means that we're still sort of building the background data that's available. In terms of my own data sets, personally, I feel that the human data set is a little small. I would have liked to have got more samples if possible, but it just wasn't available. Further, in my animal data specifically, there is a massive overrepresentation of Iron Age material. The Iron Age overshadows everything in my data. And further, going back to what I was saying about the uneven levels of archaeological investigation, the Outer Hebrides are also overrepresented in the animal data that I have as well. So to just kind of elaborate on that, this is a pie chart showing the percentages of my material that comes from various islands, specifically the animal material. So as you can see, a whopping 55% all comes from South Uist, and it's only from 2 sites that are relatively close to each other, both on the Macha and both from the Iron Age. Lewis is a very close runner-up with 23%, representing 3 different sites. But by comparison, you can see that Ailey, Skye, Tiree, they barely have any sort of representation in my data. And that's really important because, like I said earlier, sulfur is very much dependent on your underlying geology. So with the Outer Hebrides, it's relatively uniform. The geology is not that different. And that means, you know, if I have a huge amount of data, sulfur data from South Uist, that's fine because I'm unlikely to see much of a change in the sulfur values going down to Barra or going up north to Lewis. By comparison, as you can see from the map, the Inner Hebrides are considerably much more complex. There's a lot of igneous, metamorphic, a lot of a lot of different kinds of geology going on single islands, not necessarily even between islands, but on individual islands, which means it's much more difficult to know if we're getting an accurate reading in terms of the sulfur levels. We could be seeing people that we think are from Mull, but they're actually from the neighbouring mainland because there's similar geology creating similar sulfur levels. With all that in mind, these are maps of the sites that I managed to get material for. So on the left is the human remains and on the right are the animal remains. I managed to get quite a spread across both the Outer and the Inner Hebrides, which I was very relieved over. I was very concerned that I was only going to maybe get 1 or 2 sites from, say, North Uist and maybe the northern tip of Skye, where they're very close together. So I'm quite glad that I managed to get both animal and human samples from as far south as Ailey and all the way up to Lewis. That was really great. So to talk about the actual results, this is not my results. This is all of the sulfur data for prehistory in Scotland. So I collated this to get an idea of what we would expect to see across the whole of Scotland, not just in the Hebrides. So to help you understand how to read these graphs, the y-axis is the sulfur levels, that's measured in parts per million. And then across the x-axis, that's each group that I've assigned an arbitrary number to try and help group all the data together. So for these graphs, it's by council area. With others, to do with my own data, it's by site, that kind of thing. So as we can see, Scotland in general sits around 15 parts per mil, both human and animal. We're not really seeing much outside of that, maybe going down to 10. There is one outlier in the humans, but I should caveat that that assemblage from East Lothian is actually Roman. So personally, I think it's less surprising that we're maybe seeing an unusual result from that data set. But overall, going up to around 20, down as low as 10, not really getting anything below that. So this is my data. The data on the human data is rather crammed in, so I will be showing you a slightly easier to read graph later. But we can see that the animal and the human are pretty much echoing each other. And this is the human levels, so we can see much more easily here the difference between the sites. So the reason these are put on different graphs is to make it easier for everyone to see, but also because Strathclyde is a very different site to all of the sites on the left, Neep, Badavas, Papaimor. Strathclyde was actually a disarticulated assemblage. So we weren't able to take samples from people that were known individuals, but we were able to take lots of samples from molars, from femurs, and from ribs. So we kind of we need to analyze this data slightly differently, but it will still give us very interesting information, as you can see here. So pretty much all kind of along the same. There are one or two sites that are slightly higher. It would be interesting to maybe investigate the reasons behind that, why Neep and Tryvan and Killinegg have a slightly different value that sits higher than the others. So this is a comparison of my human data versus the our Scotland data. And we can see that generally the Hebrides seem to sit relatively high, but not out of the bounds of the normality for Scotland. So between 15 and 20 parts per mil. There's maybe one or two that are slightly lower than that, but overall pretty standard. The animal data, on the other hand, whilst the majority of it is sitting around the same point, mostly between 15 and 20, you can see in my data that there are two samples that returned exceptionally low results of 5 parts per mil, way below anything else, and way below anything that we have for the rest of Scotland in terms of prehistory and prehistoric sulfur data. So this really points to the fact that these two animals that these samples came from were not Hebridean. They were not from the Hebrides. They are unlikely to have been from Scotland. The closest place with sulfur levels like that would be England, Northern England. So that does point to some sort of movement taking place. So one sample is from South Uist. It's a red deer mandible from an Iron Age site. And then the other is a cow phalanx that was found in a midden on Odensay, a Mesolithic midden. So that is being radiocarbon dated because I very much doubt that that's a Mesolithic cow phalanx. And we're waiting to hear back the results on that. It's probably a later intrusion. It's just a question of how late, what period are we looking at? So in terms of the next steps, I personally need to look at trying to gauge the age of these animals. And by that, I mean trying to determine if we have immature animals or if they are adults. The reason for that is because that has a fairly drastic impact on how we interpret these results. If they are immature, then it's very possible that they arrived on these islands alive. The immature animals are much smaller, they're easier to maneuver and to take on crossings over the sea. By comparison, I don't know if you've ever tried to move a red deer or a fully grown cow. It's slightly more difficult. They're considerably larger and have more minds of their own, shall we say. So it's much more likely that those, if they were adults, they were probably slaughtered and then carried to these islands for whatever reason. It's interesting to speculate on the reasons for this. It's not like it's a particularly long journey. They were unlikely to have been at sea for multiple days, although having said that, maybe they were, we don't know. Like I said, we're waiting on the radiocarbon date results for that cow phalanx, and I will be looking into comparisons between the sites that at different locations, different soils, to see if there's maybe a reason for some of these sites having a slightly elevated sulfur level compared to others. Maybe Machair versus moorland, or maybe differences across different time periods, that sort of thing. So my current interpretations, to me, this indicates that movement was happening. We're not necessarily seeing it reflected in the human results, but it certainly is showing in the animals. And I would say this also indicates that taking 3 samples per individual, it's too broad of a brush. We're not getting the detail that we necessarily need to understand things like inter-island movements. There are a couple of reasons that we're maybe not seeing these changes in sulfur levels. There is the potential that people just weren't spending much time away when they traveled, maybe taking a couple of days away, a couple of weeks, a couple of months maximum, but not long enough to really impact their sulfur levels, which, if you think about it, does make sense. That's how people today move around. They don't necessarily go away for huge periods of time. They'll maybe go for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Alternatively, maybe we just haven't found the individuals who did all this traveling, who were all over the place with really wacky sulfur levels. Personally, I think it's probably a combination of the two. Yeah. Additionally, this does go to show the importance of zooarchaeology. I feel animal remains tend to get overlooked in what they can tell us. We tend to look at them to understand agriculture, domestication, diet, that kind of thing, but we don't necessarily look much further than that. There are a couple of studies now that are starting to do that, but I feel like this shows that the data that animal isotopes can provide are just as interesting as the human ones. And further, I feel that this shows that even when we're talking about prehistoric populations, viewing islands as being isolated is too simplistic of an approach. We need a much more nuanced view on it. So to just round up, I just would like to take us back to this quote that I started off with. And I really hope that I've managed to convey to you how accurate this living in the heart of beyond is to being an islander, particularly someone who is in research looking at island populations. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask away.
Huge applause. I'm sure everybody's clapping in their own homes. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Now is the time, folks. Come with your questions, put them in the chat, and I'll read them out. I can see folk are putting the applause symbol in the reaction.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I get really annoyed too when I see that sort of colonial attitude when folk write about Orkney, where we live here.
Yes, I thought that you must see something similar with Orkney and Shetland, just similar sort of ideas and like language. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Marianne. Can you say something about the level of the sea in prehistory?
Yes, I suppose. This is something I need to really brush up on a bit. It was different. So as far as I'm aware, it was lower across all of the. So with respect to the Outer Hebrides, that probably means that rather than one island, rather than a group of islands, we were seeing one long island, which immediately alters the way that you're moving through the landscape and how you perceive this area, because it's not necessarily, multiple islands. Um, but yeah, so that would have like constantly been changing through the Neolithic and Bronze Age with sea levels rising.
The next question is from Morag, who says, "Thank you, Mari. Has any evidence of sea travel been found? For example, log boats?"
This is actually a really interesting topic because, as far as I'm aware, not in the Hebrides, not from prehistory in the Hebrides. There is stuff from the mainland. There's been log boats and things found in various lochs and rivers, but not in the Hebrides. And I don't know why. It could be to do with preservation levels. It could be that everything got recycled. I know that today island populations are very, very good at recycling everything they have because there's not as many resources available. But yeah, it would be very exciting if somebody could find a logboat or some sort of method of travel, I don't know, in like a peat bog or something.
Jennifer asks, "Really interesting sulfur results. Have you had much chance to look at your D13C and D15N data yet? So that, and if so, what trends have you seen?"
I've had a quick look. I've mostly been focused on the sulfur because that's what I find most interesting and most exciting. I've not really, from the little bit of analysis I've done of my carbon and nitrogen, I haven't seen anything that's really stood out, but that could just be because I haven't done enough analysis of it yet. It seems fairly standard for what I would expect.
Great, thanks, she says. Have you got much time still to go on in this work?
Well, I've already overrun because of COVID. COVID had a big impact on my sample taking, actually. That's another thing that I should have maybe listed. I'm currently in my 5th year, so it's a case of the sooner I finish, the better, I think.
Yeah, and if you've got other ideas for what you would like to have done but couldn't fit into this project, that's a nice postdoc, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, or a future research project. Anna says, "Great presentation, thank you."
Thank you very much.
Okay, there aren't any other questions coming up just now. Oh, here's another one from Morag. "Do you think ancient people were just as motivated to travel as people are today? Is it frustrating not to be able to study their psychology?"
Yeah, I think so. A little bit, actually. I think that's maybe something most archaeologists can relate to. It'd be really nice to get a proper insight into the thinking and the psychology that a lot of these people and populations had. Um, I, I mean, I'm biased. I feel that, um, yeah, like I feel that people are unlikely to want to stay in one place. If you travel out to an island, you're likely to want to travel to another island. And if you have ever spent much time in the Hebrides in summertime, basically all of the islands are visible from one another. If you have a nice day, you can see Skye, Mull, Muck. You can even see Eiley and even as far as Ardnamurchan and sometimes from Barra at least. And if you're further north up in Lewis and North Uist, you can see Skye very, very vividly. So I think it's very unlikely that people weren't motivated to travel to these islands when you can literally just see them right there. It would be a bit strange to see them and never want to go near them. So yeah, I think so.
We've got messages here from Stuart and Mary, and who are saying, "Thank you, Mary. Very interesting. Well done, and keep going. Fantastic talk. Thank you."
Oh, thank you very much.
Here's another question coming up from Rose. I'm curious if there are any oral historical records, for example, stories or religious records that indicate that there was inter-island movement. Did you find any literature that would suggest that? I know from taking classes about other cultures that they often keep oral histories that are validated by archaeological records. Oh yes, like in the Pacific Islands where they have the stories about the arriving in canoes and that kind of thing. Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't think there's anything going that far back for the Hebrides, sadly. We do have a lot of stories and oral, like a lot of oral culture that go back as far as the Vikings, at least. So, yeah, like in in history since at least that point, there's a lot of stories talking about inter-island travel and I'm obviously, as I'm from Barra, I have a very Barra perspective. So there's a lot of stories about MacNeil of Barra going and raiding up in Uist and going to other islands and stealing um, like stones that were marking graves on Iona and that kind of thing. There's a lot of that sort of oral history, but sadly, we don't quite have as far back as some other cultures. That would be amazing if we did.
um, and Anna says, I enjoyed the part about managing animal movement. Will you be able to track any inter-island breeding of animals?
Oh, that would be interesting. I think that would be something for somebody who does DNA work. I know that there was a study a few years back that looked at the red deer on Uist, and they have found that modern populations of red deer on Uist are not related or genetically similar to ones on the mainland of Scotland. I think also maybe in Orkney as well. I can't remember, but I know that the ones in South Uist, they're not related to any deer on the mainland. So it'd be interesting to see if someone could follow up on that with aDNA, like ancient DNA.
Yeah, we've got the PhD students starting here in Orkney now to be working on red deer. That's Kath Page.
Oh, that would be very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I see lovely comments here from Kim and Rose, who are both saying thank you for making these talks freely available. Very much appreciate you saying that, and huge thanks to Mari as well, who's sharing her research with us so freely. And Rose says she's attending from Nevada. Wow.
Thank you for joining, Rose.
Okay, that's the bottom of the questions again. So and our time is nearly up as well. So yes, let's all give Mari a huge round of applause from wherever we are, from Nevada to I don't know where everybody is. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for
Fabulous.
having me.